Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, after Brexit, Britain will be looking to secure a range of trade deals outside of Europe, trading more with countries like Australia, Canada and New Zealand, for example. But how easy is it to trade with countries that are much further afield? Emma Vardy has been taking a look.
Some say Brexit could mean big opportunities for Britain to expand its business. And for consumers, in theory, it could mean there'll be new global produce for us to buy at better prices. The think tank Open Europe says, according to its research, at the moment we're not realising the full potential of markets outside the EU.
We found that we're actually under-trading in goods and services with lots of countries that we should be doing more with.
But some experts warn distance makes some trade more difficult.
Well, we can always trade with other countries on the other side of the world, but it's sort of costly and expensive and a bit awkward to do so. So we do have trade with countries like Australia and New Zealand, but nothing like the amount of trade that we have with our neighbours in Europe. You know, being in the same time zone, having goods tied up in ships is bad news.
Before we joined the EU, Britain used to trade more with the Commonwealth.
They're being shipped to Australia to improve the strain of the cattle there, and will come back as better beef for your table than the foreigner can supply.
Some argue that re-establishing these links post-Brexit will be key, and that because the services industry now plays a bigger role, according to Open Europe, distance doesn't have to be a drawback.
You still may have to get on a plane occasionally and go and meet somebody face to face, but a lot of this can now be done online. So digital services are changing the way that companies can trade with across the world.
And that's something being echoed by Trade Secretary Liam Fox.
The real gain for the United Kingdom is to get a global liberalisation in the services sector.
He's already laying some of the groundwork for trading further afield and has told an Australian parliamentary committee the UK wants to rapidly establish a free trade deal with Australia after the UK's exit from the EU. But there are warnings getting deals with countries further afield may be a slower task and deliver less than some may hope for.
I suspect we're not being realistic about how long it will take, and I think we're probably not being realistic about how much extra trade we'll get. Australia is a relatively small economy, and a lot of the trade we already have actually isn't interfered with by trade barriers. So, yeah, great if we can have a trade agreement, but it's not going to change the world.
For all the talk, it's only when the UK really gets down to the business of carving out a new trading position in the world will we find out whether our ambitions can be realised.
Emma Vardy there. Well, Alexander, Dana, let's look at the logistics, because the point was made a few times in that film. A commercial flight from London to Australia is around 23 hours. Time zones-wise, Canberra is 9 hours ahead of London. I mean, when it comes to the free movement of goods and people, it is just a lot easier, isn't it, to do it with your neighbours who are geographically closer?
Well, it's not really a principle of economics that we apply. We look for markets where we can sell, and some of them are proximate and some of them aren't. So the nearest country to Australia is Papua New Guinea. So it goes without saying that's not one of our major trading partners. The next nearest is Indonesia, and that was 11th, our 12th largest trading partner. Our biggest trading partners are actually a long way away. They're China, they're Korea, they're Japan, they're the United States.
But isn't that really a symptom of where you are, Australia, whereas we have, obviously, the continent of Europe right on our doorstep?
Well, it's not, in other words, a principle that we trade just with countries that are near to us. And that principle is wrong. It's where you have a comparative advantage that you trade. So, I mean, we used to have a huge amount of agricultural trade with the UK, and the distance was exactly the same then as as it is now. A huge amount of agricultural trade that was cut out when Britain joined the European Union. So it proves the point that if we had free trade again with the UK, I don't know what we would export, it's hard to predict, but Australian exporters would be interested in the British market. But more than that, Australian importers would be interested in the UK because it's a place you could get things of high quality at a good price.
But if you look at even the quantity of trade that is currently done when it comes to UK trade and Australia, I mean, it's a fraction of the trade, obviously, with the EU. And I know one doesn't have to rule out the other necessarily, but you're talking about a massive gap here.
Yeah, but you're not going to cut off all trade with the EU.
I said that. I said you weren't going to cancel out, but you're going to have to make
this home because people often make this point. I mean, it's
not a zero-sum game in that sense.
It's a fatuous proposition to say all British trade with the EU is going to end. I'm sure an enormous amount of trade will continue, and of course, it also not just to think about Australia alone, but to think about trading relationships with all sorts of countries. China is the second biggest economy in the world. It's growing at 6.5%. It has a rapidly growing, as you do through Asia, a rapidly growing middle class. Now, for us in Australia, we've really targeted, not because these countries are close, they're a long way away. Beijing is no closer to Sydney than it is to London.
But are we right to look at Australia and New Zealand and, you know, other countries outside the EU as this sort of great utopia, if you like, outside of the EU? When you look, UK exports to Australia last year were worth around £9 billion. UK exports to the EU last year were around £241 billion. Even taking your point that we're not going to stop trading with the EU, there would have to be an awful lot of trade done with those other countries to justify, if you like, in the words of the government, that it's worthwhile.
I think, number one, as an outsider, so it might be a bit presumptuous of me to say this, but it seems to make perfect sense for you to retain some kind of free trade arrangement with the EU. But number two, just to sort of make a mathematical point, if 60% of your trade is with the outside world, 60% of your trade is not with the EU, then it does make sense to liberalise as much of that 60% as you can, as well as maintaining liberal trade with the other 40%. Now, that is a win-win for the UK if you can achieve that.
Let's talk about the practical arrangements, because these free trade deals cannot be done or signed until the UK actually leaves the EU. Now, March 2019 is the date that's talked about, but we could have transitional arrangements. In fact, that is probably quite likely. Do you think during that transitional period that the UK should be able to negotiate its own free trade agreements, even if it is part of the customs union?
Well, number one, let me say we wouldn't have thought transitional arrangements would be very surprising, because in our trade negotiations we inevitably have transitional arrangements before the new trade agreement takes full effect. So if you were to do the same, that wouldn't be surprising. Number two, of course, it would depend. I mean, if you remain in the customs union, then you can't, in the customs union, have free trade agreements with other countries.
So it could be many years before we have anything like a trade deal with Australia.
It depends, but however, it depends, number one, on how long you remained in the customs union, and number two, on the extent to which the European Union would nevertheless be happy you having left the European Union, which is an issue of legal competence in relation to trade. Having left the European Union, you could, I suppose, negotiate a trade agreement with another country which wouldn't come into force until you left.
So you agree with Liam Foxy, our International Trade Secretary, who says you should be able to negotiate during that that transitional arrangement, which we can't do now. You can just scope out, as he's called it.
So I'd make one observation here about the debate about the terms of you leaving the European Union. It's a negotiation. So nobody quite knows how it's going to turn out, because there are a lot of quid pro quos involved. The British government's clear aspiration is to be able to negotiate trade agreements with other countries once it leaves the EU, and to retain free trade with the EU. So in those circumstances, that would be good for our bilateral relationship and for your relationship with a whole range of countries like Japan and China and India and so on.
All right.
I mean, will it work out that way? That depends how the negotiation transpires.
Sure, and that will be part of it. What are your views on freedom of movement when it comes to a bilateral trade deal between Australia and the UK? When, and that happens whenever we leave. I mean, Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, said in October last year she had no plans to increase the UK's intake of Australians. Do you agree with her?
We don't believe, with any of our trade agreements, in negotiating at the same time complete freedom of movement. The only exception we have is with New Zealand. But we have no freedom of movement arrangements with any country in the world other than New Zealand, and we have no plans to do that. We have a non-discriminatory policy in relation to people visiting Australia, as well as migrants. Not everybody, by the way, who comes to Australia we define as a migrant. People who are migrants who come to us, people who come to Australia with the intention of permanently settling there. But we have a non-discriminatory policy. Now, in a negotiation on trade, we might look at ways of enhancing, facilitating people like academics, students, business people being able to move between our countries.
With larger numbers?
But possibly, yes. I mean, we already have some access to Britain for Australians in certain circumstances, and we could perhaps facilitate access for business people in companies that are investing in the UK.
All right.
Could make it better than it currently is.
Let's leave it there.
I've been